All right, diving in today. And this one hits home for a lot of folks, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
You sent us Erica Komisar's book, Being There, subtitle is Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. So much packed in there, right? About just the impact of a mother's presence, especially those early years, like 0 to 3.
Right, right. And she, Komisar's a psychoanalyst, so she's coming at it from all these years of clinical experience, but then, really backing it up with research, the stats, all of that, to make this case for, why that mother's presence, emotionally but physically too, really matters in those first 3 years.
Makes sense. And for our listeners, I mean, whether you're in it right now, those early years, or thinking about having kids, or just, I don't know, fascinated by how we think about family these days, right? The goal is, like always, to pull out what's most useful here, cut through any, I don't know, any of the mommy wars stuff that this can get into, and just get to the heart of it.
Exactly. And, Komisar doesn't beat around the bush. She's like upfront. Her
Hmm.
core argument is in those first 3 years, with a mother's time, her attention, the focus she gives more is more, like directly. More time, more attention equals more benefit for the kid's development, socially, cognitively, all of that.
And she uses this quote that, like, it stuck with me. She quotes Dr. Thomas K. McInerney. He was president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And he called that interaction, that positive back and forth between mom and baby in those early years, he calls it critically important. Not just, oh, it's nice, but like foundational.
Yeah, no, and there's a study from Stanford that she brings up that kind of blew my mind. They looked at how a child's brain responds, and it lights up way more to their mother's voice than to any other voice. And it's not just the hearing part of the brain, it's the areas for emotions, for social stuff too. So like on a neurological level, you're literally shaping how they experience the world.
Whoa, that is wild. So, to our listeners, I mean, think about it. Your voice isn't just sound, it's like building their emotional landscape, you
Hmm.
know? And Commissar, she argues that the more of you there is, especially in those early years, the better chance that kid has of being secure emotionally, less stressed out, better at managing their own feelings. And that whole thing of emotional intelligence, picking up on social cues, forming close bonds later on.
All that stuff that we wish we had more of as adults.
Right, exactly.
And, Commissar, she kind of takes on some of the things we tell ourselves, these myths of modern motherhood, right?
Oh, let's get into those because there are so many.
Oh, yeah.
Like starting with, I mean, the big one, right? Quality time trumps quantity time. We hear that all the time, especially working parents. Like, oh, but I give them such focused attention when I'm there.
And that focus is important, right? But Commissar is saying you can't have that true emotional presence if you're not physically present a lot of the time,
Yeah.
too. It's like those little moments, the connection, the understanding, it happens in the everyday stuff, not just the planned activities,
Yeah.
a baby's first smile needing to be soothed. You can't, like, schedule those.
And she brings up Frank Bruni. He wrote that piece for the New York Times, all about this myth of quality time. He's like, just be there, be available. It's not checking boxes, it's being in the flow of it all.
Totally. And she throws in this stat from Pew, the Pew Charitable Research Foundation. They found that the average working mom, she spends about 90 minutes a day with her child. 90 minutes, that's it. So if that's all you're banking on, it's tough to have a deep connection.
Wow, yeah, no kidding. It's like you can't just schedule connection, you got to be present to make it happen.
Exactly.
Okay, what's another myth she tackles?
Oh, this one's, it's a doozy and kind of damaging. The idea that to be a good mom, you got to neglect your own needs, like total self-sacrifice all the time.
Yeah, that sets the bar impossibly high.
Right. And Commissar, she's not saying motherhood's not about giving a lot, but she brings in this concept that, Donald Winnicott, he was this pediatrician psychoanalyst. He talked about the good enough mother. And then there's also Jennifer Kunst. She describes the real mother, someone who, yeah, there's that selfless love, but there's frustration too. It's real life.
So it's striving to be good, meeting those needs the kid has, that emotional security, but not thinking you gotta be perfect or completely lose yourself.
Exactly. Finding that balance.
Okay, what else? What other myth does she go after?
Oh, this one gets right into attachment theory, the heart of it. The idea that any caregiver can provide that same level of attachment as the mother, especially those first few years.
And that feels, I don't know, almost like at the core of what Commissar is saying.
Yeah, she's really emphasizing that the mother's role, physically, emotionally, it's unique and, in her view, irreplaceable, especially 0 to 3.
Okay, so unpack that a little.
Okay, so she talks about Myron A. Hoffer. He called mothers psychobiological regulators. Think about it. In those early months, You're not just feeding, changing diapers. You're helping their little systems, their body temperature, heart rate, even how they feel big emotions. Learn to regulate all that. Your presence is like the external regulator.
Wow, that's a lot more than we usually give moms credit for.
Right. And then there's the hormones, right? Oxytocin, vasopressin, all those linked to nurturing, protective stuff. And moms produce them, of course. But she points out that dads do too. Just the levels, how they show up, it can be different. And that impacts how they nurture. She mentions Dr. Tom Insel at NIH and Dr. Ruth Feldman. She's done all this research on how moms and dads interact differently.
Like, what are some of the differences? I'm curious now.
So Feldman's research shows that dads, they tend to be more playful, stimulating, right?
Right.
Moms more calming, soothing, more touch, more eye contact.
Yeah.
And they even did studies where they gave dads oxytocin, and they did become more like motherly, but their style was still more on the playful side.
Yeah.
So it really shows how both parents, crucial, but they bring different things and it all works together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So going back to that quality versus quantity time thing,
Okay, yeah.
Komisar revisits it, but with all these details about how babies and toddlers learn to handle their emotions, that emotional regulation piece.
Right, because that's huge, especially those first few years.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And she's like, it doesn't just happen. It's not a switch that flips. It's moment by moment, constant. She uses this image, I love this, of a baby being like a little boat on this sea of feelings, and that sea, it can get stormy fast.
Yeah.
And mother's presence, it's like the ballast in the boat, keeping it stable, preventing the baby from being totally overwhelmed.
That is such a good visual.
Right. And she says that consistency, the mom's steady presence and how she responds, that's what gives the baby the security they need to eventually separate a little, become more independent in a healthy way. Because a baby doesn't get time and absence the way we do.
They just know you're gone. And it's scary.
Exactly. And if it's always changing, who's taking care of them, how they're responding, it's unpredictable, can make a baby withdraw, get fearful, even aggressive sometimes from that anxiety.
It's like they don't have that stable ground to build on.
Exactly. Now, she also talks about breastfeeding and this belief that it's just about nutrition, which, sure, breast milk, all the benefits, but she's saying it's way more than that.
Oh, for sure. It's such a bonding experience.
Totally. She talks about it as like potentially the most profound physical and emotional connection you can have with another person. And just physically, the baby has to suck, right? That helps them learn to tolerate a bit of frustration, which is a good thing developmentally. Even the best fake nipples can't quite replicate that.
Right. There's a whole system at work there.
Exactly. And pumping, she acknowledges, the milk is great, but it doesn't give you that full closeness, physically, emotionally, that breastfeeding does. She's saying those first few years are all about needing that loving touch, nurturing, cuddling, comfort, all of it, consistently. And there's even a study showing that physical touch, it lowers cortisol levels, that stress hormone, in both baby and mom. So it's like biologically calming.
Okay, so we've talked about all these myths and kind of the benefits of being present. What about the flip side? What does Komisar say about when a mom isn't there enough?
Well, she gets into some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
She sees this connection between a mom being absent emotionally or physically and, the increase in emotional and behavioral problems we're seeing in kids.
Like, give us some specifics, because I know she cites some pretty alarming stats.
Yeah, for example, she points to the CDC data showing this huge rise in ADHD diagnoses in kids and teens. And there's been a massive increase in antidepressants being prescribed to kids over 12 since the late 80s.
That is scary.
It is. And it's not just diagnoses, right? It's eating disorders going up, more violence, aggression, bullying among kids, all that.
It's like everything's getting more intense.
It seems that way. And Komisar is careful, publicly, experts don't want to say this causes that directly. But she says clinically, there's more and more awareness of the link between moms who aren't emotionally engaged or who are physically absent a lot and all these problems kids are having. And it's not just anecdotal. She points to all this research from neuroscience, hormones, attachment theory, even epigenetics, how our environment affects our genes. It's all pointing in that direction.
Wow, that's a lot to consider.
It is. And she even quotes this poem, Philip Larkin, this Be the Verse, about how like the messed up stuff from our upbringing, it can get passed down, even if we don't mean for it to.
Oh, man, that's heavy.
It is. But it's important to think about.
So, okay, so we see this correlation, right, between the mom's absence and these problems. What are some of the specific ways it shows up in kids, according to Komisar?
Well, she talks about how hypervigilance, that always on edge feeling that comes from anxiety, it makes it so hard for a kid to learn to be social, to relax.
They're always in fight or flight mode.
Exactly. And aggression, she's like, yeah, it's a survival instinct, but a mom being present, that helps a kid learn to control it, to have healthy boundaries.
Otherwise, it just comes out sideways, right?
Right. And then there's all the social stuff. Kids who haven't had that consistent emotional connection, they have more separation anxiety, trouble playing with others, trouble understanding boundaries, like what's okay, what's not.
It's like they're missing that basic blueprint for how to be with other people.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Komisar connects all of this back to the brain, how it actually develops. She mentions Tottenham and how a secure attachment with mom, it shapes the limbic system, which is like the emotional control center. So your presence early on, it's building that resilience, that ability to regulate feelings.
So it's not just about feeling loved, it's literally wiring their brains differently. She also talks about object constancy.
Yes, that's the baby. Understanding that even when you're not there, you still exist, you'll come back. Separation anxiety, it's actually a good sign in a way. It means they're getting that. And when you return, you acknowledge their sadness, their anger even. It helps repair that feeling of loss, builds trust.
So even when it's tough, when they're freaking out, it's part of the process.
Right. And she points out how infants and toddlers react differently to mom leaving. Infants, they get so overwhelmed, they might even seem to reject mom for a second when she comes back.
Like they're so mad.
Right. But toddlers, they have more brain power, they can understand better, and eventually forgive the absence. This ties back to Winnicott, that good enough mother. It's not about being perfect, it's being there enough, getting it right enough, repairing those little ruptures. That's how they build that secure base.
Makes a lot of sense. So, okay, if we're going to aim for good enough, what does that actually look like? What's Komisar's take on being a present mother?
Well, it's definitely not just being in the same room. She's big on focusing, being in the moment, that mindfulness stuff. And she's like really tough on distractions, especially our phones. They're the enemy of presence.
Oh, tell me about it.
Right. And she has some super practical tips like being face-to-face with baby in the stroller, no phones for caregivers during certain times, making sure baby can see your face when you're talking to them, phone-free times at home. Little stuff, but it makes a difference.
Those are good ones. I'm writing these down.
Do it. And she brings up Tottenham again, how moms are basically an external regulator for baby's nervous system up to around age 2. So how you are emotionally, how you react, it impacts them hugely.
Wow. That's a lot of pressure, but also I guess it's empowering in a way to know you have that much influence.
Totally. And part of being present is that emotional regulation piece. You noticing, naming, reflecting back baby's feelings.
Hmm?
Like if they're crying, you say, oh, sweetheart, you seem so sad right now. It helps them start to understand their own inner world.
It's like you're giving them the vocabulary for their feelings.
Exactly. And she talks about communicating with babies as an art. It takes practice, being present, to read those cues, the cries, expressions, body language. It's a whole language to learn.
And then there's toddlers. Oh, boy.
Oh, yeah, they're a whole other world, right? All about rules, testing limits that push and pull. She says empathy is key here, and putting words to their feelings, even when they're melting down, like, I know you're so mad you can't have another cookie, validates them, even if the limit stands.
That makes sense. Acknowledging without always giving in.
Right, and she gets into mom guilt, which we all have it.
Yeah.
But some moms have this intense stress response to baby crying, almost like trauma. She suggests things like yoga, meditation, therapy can help manage that.
It's okay to get help, to find what works for you.
Absolutely. And she makes this distinction about crying before age 1. It's usually a true need, fear, got to respond to that. But the cry it out stuff later, she links that to some negative long-term consequences.
Interesting. So respond to those early cries, but later you can be more flexible.
That's her take, yeah. And then there's play. Can't forget play. Komisar is big on it for emotional development, social skills, bonding. She gives examples for different ages, peekaboo, object permanence games for little ones, more physical, imaginative play for toddlers.
Play is so important, but it's easy to forget when you're in the thick of it, you know?
Oh, totally. And then nighttime separation. She's reassuring it's normal for them to be unsettled. It's a big separation. Respond quickly. Soothe them.
Yeah, makes sense. What about for working moms? Any advice there?
Oh, yeah, she's got a whole section on that. She says, create that buffer before bed. Really connect. Make the kid your priority when you get home. If you can, stagger bedtimes, so you have one-on-one time with each. Keep work separate as much as possible when you're with them.
Okay, so it's about like being intentional with the time you do have.
Exactly. And for caregiving, in general, she says individual care is best, ideally, if mom can't do it all. And she contrasts the alloparenting model, where care is shared among a close group, like in many cultures, versus our Western model, where it's often less familiar caregivers.
Makes you think about how we structure
Right.
things.
And if it's dad as primary caregiver, she says they got to develop those sensitive, responsive, motherly behaviors too.
So regardless of who's doing it, those qualities are key.
Consistency is everything.
And she talks about moment-to-moment repair, right? Like little misattunements, how to handle those.
Oh, yeah, she gives this great example of mom and baby reconnecting after a distraction. The point is pause, tune into baby, reassure. And she says that reaction to separation, being upset when you leave, happy when you're back, that's healthy, unless it's totally absent or way too extreme.
So it's normal for them to have big feelings about it.
Right. And when you return, put everything else aside, focus on that reconnection.
Okay, so we've talked about presence, but let's go back to the cost of absence, dig into that some more with specific examples, maybe even how it plays out in society.
Okay, so Komisar links those early experiences with mom, or lack thereof, to things like anxiety later on, depression, social problems, even eating disorders.
Hmm.
And she's careful to say, even subtle emotional neglect, like being chronically absent or just not tuned in, it can do damage.
It's not always the big dramatic stuff. Sometimes it's the everyday disconnection.
Exactly. And she's like, all the stuff, the nice house, the toys, you can't replace that basic need for emotional connection, secure attachment, especially with mom in those early years.
It's about feeling seen and understood more than anything.
Right. And she talks about stress, the HPA axis, how chronic stress early on, it can actually change the brain long term, leading to things like hypervigilance, attention problems. And she reiterates that link between insecure attachment in infancy and higher chances of anxiety, ADHD later.
It's like a domino effect starting so young.
Totally. And mom's own emotional state, it matters hugely. She says mom's anxiety, the baby can almost absorb it, get more anxious themselves. And if mom's depressed, that emotional absence, it impacts the kid's development emotionally and socially.
It's like they're so tuned into us, picking up on everything.
They are. And she even brings up this study with rats, Michael Meaney's work, where mother rats who nurtured well, it changed their pups' genes and those changes got passed down. It's like how we nurture literally has a biological impact lasting generations.
That is mind-blowing, so much to think about.
Right. And she gets into why moms go back to work so fast, which is complex, right? Their own needs, societal pressure, finances. But she's saying that intense dependence of a baby those first 3 years, it's not a bad thing, it's a phase, needed to become a healthy, interdependent person.
But our culture pushes against that. It's like, get back to work, get back to normal.
Exactly. And she talks about postpartum depression, how hard it can be, the constant demands of infant care, especially if mom had her own needs unmet as a kid, or these idealized views of motherhood. She gives examples. Julie, feeling pressured to return to her big career. Joanna, overwhelmed as a stay-at-home mom, feeling isolated. It's real.
And then there's Carol, right?
Oh, Carol's story gets me. Feeling like she lost herself as a stay-at-home mom, went back to work early, but regretted missing those years. It shows how society doesn't value mothering enough, pushes women towards career over everything.
It's like we don't have the structures in place to support both.
Exactly. And Komisar quotes Daniel Hill about how crucial that mother-child bond is, especially early on. And she's frustrated, even within feminism, there's pushback on talking about maternity leave, support for moms, because of this having it all thing.
Right, like you can't even admit that maybe one has to come before the other for a while.
Yeah, and society often pushes work over raising little kids, even though what little kids need most was often mom. Now, she does say there are exceptions. Like working-class single moms, financial stability can help kids a lot.
Yeah, the basics have to be covered.
For sure. But she warns, in wealthier families, kids can feel it when parents prioritize work over their emotional needs. It's like detachment, rejection. She references The Price of Privilege, that book by Madeline Levine.
Kids pick up on it even if we think we're hiding it well.
They do. And Komisar talks about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. He found all these long-term negative health outcomes, mental and physical, linked to neglect, abuse, stress in childhood. And that costs society a ton. In healthcare, everything.
So it's not just a family issue, it's a societal issue too.
Exactly. And she points out how the economy loses out when talented women leave the workforce or take lesser roles because there's no decent maternity leave, no flexibility. She gives examples. Virgin Group, Netflix, they found giving generous parental leave actually helps them keep employees. And Susan Wojcicki at Google, when they expanded maternity leave, way fewer new moms quit.
So it's good business sense, but it's also, like, ethically the right thing to do.
Totally. And she mentions Anne-Marie Slaughter's book, Unfinished Business, about how this lack of support, it forces moms into these impossible choices, career or kids.
Yeah, it's a system set up to make it hard.
It is. And Komisar, she acknowledges dads are stepping up more stay-at-home dads. But for them to be truly effective primary caregivers, they often need to develop those motherly qualities, that sensitivity, that responsiveness. It matters for development.
So it's not just about who's home, it's about how they're showing up.
Exactly. And in the end, she's like, look, that work before family mindset, it hurts kids emotionally, mentally, doesn't matter which parent's doing it.
So this whole deep dive into being there, it's really about, like, shifting our values, right?
In a way, yeah. Komisar's saying that mother's presence, physically, emotionally, those first 3 years, it's foundational. It's about how kids learn to manage their emotions, handle stress, form healthy relationships for their whole lives.
It's a lot to take in, but super important.
It is, and I'm curious, for our listeners, after hearing all of this, what societal changes do you think we need to really value and support families and the work of raising little kids? Maybe think about parental leave policies, workplace flexibility, all of that through this lens.
Yeah, it's a big question, but one worth wrestling with.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.
See you next time.
See ya.